Okay, we come to the we come to the final session of the day. Thank you for staying with us. It's been a long day, but I think a good day. And as I said a moment ago, this final session is looking at future-proofing public service media for the age of platforms. And we've got doing this Professor Catherine Johnson and Dr. Dan Martin at the University of Leeds. But I'll let our excellent chair for this session, Torin Douglas, to do the full introductions. Torin is very well known to us, another long-term member of the VLV, and of course a distinguished broadcaster, commentator, and general media person about town. So over to you, Torin.
Thank you very much, Colin. Welcome, everybody. Wake up, come on. It's the last session. I thought Peter finally got there in the end about trying to galvanise us to do something. And I think if that wasn't a clarion call for the levy, I don't know what was. So I'm certainly up for that. And if it's fisticuffs with Donald Trump, that's probably even better. So anyway, following on from that session, it is obvious that there is so much change going on in this industry at the moment. We heard in Roger Bolton's session this morning from Everyone TV how complicated and fast-changing and far-reaching are all the changes in the streaming age. There was a question in that session about where were all of the highlighting of the PSB genre in that, and they were not there at all. And that's what we're going to come to here, because our topic is future-proofing public service media for the age of platforms or streaming. And we're hearing from two researchers from the University of Leeds. They're going to be launching this research, I'm delighted to say, in September in Brussels. We are hearing it first, so you have an exclusive here. I think it's slightly academic, but they will be the ones to recognise that we're not the academe audience that you're going to have in Brussels. But anyway, Professor Catherine Johnson, she's Professor of Media and Communication at the University of Leeds and, as Colin said, a VLV trustee. She's a leading authority on the screen media industries. She specialises in television, digital media and public service broadcasting. Now based at the University of Leeds, she was previously in leadership roles at the University of Huddersfield and Nottingham, and she directs major research projects examining the impact of the global streaming platforms and changing viewer behaviour. And she has had influence on the BBC, Channel 4, YouTube, Ofcom, DCMS, so you're right plugged in there, and we're very lucky to have her here there. Her colleague is Dan Martin, Dr. Dan Martin. He joined the University of Leeds in 2023 as a postdoctoral research fellow, and he's working with her on this. It's the EU, is it chance-funded?
Yeah, it's EU funding.
It's the EU chance-funded project on the impact of global streaming platforms on traditional public service broadcasters across Europe and North America. So that's what they're going to be talking about. I did notice that Dan earned his PhD with a thesis on representations of northern working class masculinity in British media. That will be for another time. Anyway, Caroline, over to you.
Or in the questions, maybe you can ask Dan a question about his PhD. Yeah. Thanks. Right, okay. Just checking how to use this. So I promise that we won't, as long as I can get this to click forward. Someone needs to show me how to click the slides forward. Is there a clicker? There's a screen here and there's a clicky button, but it doesn't do anything. A mouse.
There's somebody waving from a window up there. No mouse.
I can't. I think someone's coming down. Yeah. I'll do a spiel and we'll wait for someone to come down. So the project is a 3-year project we've been doing for about 2.5 years. We've pretty much done all of the primary research, and we're aiming to understand how public service media organisations, regulators and policymakers are responding to the rise of global platforms and streamers. We euphemistically call this the age of streamers, and the impact it has on the social and cultural values of public service media. If I could get my slide to work, you'd see a nice little graphic of the countries that we're looking at. But we're looking at 6 countries, Canada, UK, Denmark, Belgium and Poland. Thank you. And in those countries, we're looking at the largest public service broadcasters where there's more than one. It just doesn't seem to be... Hooray! Right, don't go into live. Yes! These are the countries that we're looking at. We're primarily focusing on the European case, but we've done some comparative research with Canada, and we're looking at these 10 public service broadcasters. The funding that we have is from this consortium called Chance, so it's entirely independently funded. It's academic funding. What we're basically doing with the project, and I should say Dan and I are representing a team of 14 scholars across all of those different countries. We're looking at 3 broad areas. So we've done analysis of policy and regulatory documents and debates, which we largely did in 2023. We looked at trade documents and undertook 81 semi-structured interviews. So that's basically going and talking to people in middle and top management positions in all of the public service broadcasters in our European part of our study. We've done some analysis of the linear schedules and the video on demand interfaces. I'll talk a bit more about that at the moment. And Dan's currently doing some program analysis, which we won't talk about today because we haven't quite finished it. So in terms of what we did with the linear schedules and the interfaces, we took a sample week in November 23, and we took screenshots from each of the home pages every day over that week. And then we compared the top bit of the interface, so that's what it looked like on iPlayer. It's the hero board at the top and the first deck there. But it was what you can see without scrolling down and without scrolling right. So when you just load it up, what you can see. And we compared that with the primetime linear schedules for the same day. And then we also fed personalised accounts. So in those accounts, we created genre-specific accounts where we just watched quiz shows or we just watched crime dramas to see how personalisation was affecting what was happening on the video on demand service. And we did that just for the broadcast VODs that were included in the remit. And then again, we took screenshots of the home pages and we compared the personalised account with the clean account. That's my method bit done, out of the way. So I'm going to hand over to Dan. He's going to take you through the key findings. We're focusing today on the things that we found that were shared across all of our different broadcasters that come from very different sizes of media market, very different in terms of the legitimacy and status of public service media. These are the challenges that everybody's facing, basically. So I'll hand over to Dan.
Thank you, Kathy. So, we really identified 4 key headline challenges, and that is audience reach, brand awareness and brand value, the sustainability of content and service offers, and organisational path dependencies, which I'll get into shortly. So, speaking from a UK perspective, it's probably unsurprising to hear that concerns over audience reach, particularly reaching younger, digitally native audiences, are driving strategic realignment in PSM towards digital-first distribution. But what we saw across our cases was a variety of positions being taken up in this transition to digital-first, and decisions around this transition are dependent largely on where the audience is. So we looked at Italy, for example. Our colleagues in Italy looked at a context in which broadcast viewership is still very strong, and the public service broadcaster RAI still commissions the vast majority of its content for linear, with its VOD service RAI Play being largely a kind of supplementary or catch-up service. Whereas in markets like the UK and like in Denmark, where broadband access, for instance, is high relatively across the population, this transition to VOD as front door has already happened. It's well underway. So business models, we found, also played a significant contributing factor. For organisations fully or partly ad-funded, the digital advertising model and its marketplace can still not really cover that loss of broadcast linear advertising, slowing that transition down further. But although we see a lot of variation in strategy at one level, we do see commonalities, particularly, and this is one of the kind of headlines, a commonality in commissioning strategies that almost all the PSMs are adapting. So a very clear theme arose, which we saw this contrast to a sort of mixed diet generalist ethos of broadcast scheduling and primetime broadcast scheduling, PSM organisations, when we spoke to them, were stressing the critical importance of two very specific categories of programming to successfully reaching and retaining viewers. And ITV's parlance, you might have seen, this is what they call fireworks and bonfires. So on the one hand, fireworks, those big event television, high production value programming that's meant to bring in viewers to the VOD in large numbers. And on the other hand, bonfires, those long-running series, bingeable box sets that can encourage long-tail viewing over a long period of time. And the idea is you draw the viewers in with the fireworks and you keep them there for the next few hours with Gilmore Girls or a kind of box set. And in ITV, it's often American sitcoms that they sort of use for bonfires. And while ITV's language is what we've used, there are kind of comparable metaphors across our case study nations. So particularly that fireworks concept. For the Flemish broadcaster VRT, they refer to bullseye programming, which is that big programming that draws viewership across services, can work on linear, can work on VOD. And for DR, the Danish broadcaster, they call this lighthouse programming, and it all kind of serves the same sort of function. But what our analysis showed actually was that these strategies are resulting in a quite limited offer of genre in what we've defined as the prime space of a VOD interface. So the top programs that are being pushed in the hero board, we kind of saw a bit of that, and that was something that was questioned around freely before. So compared to prime time, where there is a clear prioritization of a mixed approach, in prime space, there's a prioritization of three genres: fiction, drama, films, and some comedy, entertainment, and high-end documentary. It might be a little bit hard to read the colour scheme and the key here, but red is fiction, blue is entertainment, and green is documentary. And so we can see a sort of clear disparity here between VOD prime space and prime time. And what we saw also then is sort of news and current affairs being featured far less prominently in prime space in the VOD, and really basically being kind of prime time content, essentially being left to this service. So news here is orange, and current affairs is purple. So again, barely any on the left, quite a significant amount on the right. And so we're seeing these almost kind of segregated services with distinct content priorities. And for BVODs, it's a kind of close correspondence to the content strategies that commercial streamers like Netflix are employing. So again, drama, fiction, entertainment, high-end documentary. And this is seen as a necessity to reach and retain viewers in this digital media landscape. So these challenges of reach are closely imbricated with challenges around relevance and brand awareness. Brand awareness was a consistent problem raised from our interviews, particularly for PSMs that skew younger in viewership. So a demographic which, it wouldn't be news to any of us, that is shown to have less awareness and less connection to PSM brands. I mean, Ofcom research and reports have shown that consistently. And amongst broadcasters who are, to some extent, this is also a problem to broadcasters who are trying to rehabilitate their brand as trusted and valued public service. So one of our case studies is TVP in Poland, which has had recent problems with kind of media capture by its far-right government, and is trying to sort of rehabilitate its image and its brand in this context, but within a sort of difficult political climate as well. So, interestingly, this problem of branding has been tackled in quite different ways across our cases. So, there's the diversification approach which Channel 4 uses to reach different fragmented viewing groups. So, Channel 4 has, do we have any watchers of Channel 4.0, their YouTube content creator YouTube channel in the room? Thank you. They have their own YouTube channel that uses 4's branding to some extent, but is also clearly trying to create its own content creator, social media style branding. Someone we spoke to at Channel 4 kind of compared it to Mr. Beast, if we have any Mr. Beast watchers in the room. He's like the sort of main figurehead currently of YouTube. And in the opposite direction, we have consolidation. So the broadcaster in Wallonia, RTBF, they launched their VOD as just Orvio, But in recent years, they've moved to rebrand as RTBF Audio in order to signal that its public service identity is in that service and to consolidate an audience in a rapidly digitizing context. And so when discussing this challenge of brand awareness, we get to a kind of key tension point, which is the issue of third-party distribution, which is kind of the looming issue for broadcasters across the continent. Particularly this question of distributing content on social media and video sharing platforms like YouTube. Predominantly, we found organizations still want to treat these third-party platforms for marketing and promotional purposes only, so not actually syndicating their programs on them, with the goal then to kind of bring viewers back to broadcasters' owned and operated services. As this sort of quote from the head of content at DR about the task being to kind of help people back onto their own services and be able to point people home, so to speak. But the long-term feasibility of maintaining content reach outside of these services is a looming issue. And the anomaly at the time in our study was Channel 4. This was before ITV had struck a deal with YouTube, whose obligation to reach younger viewers has led to a seemingly platform-neutral approach adopted in their fast-forward strategy. So they distribute long-form and short-form content through their YouTube channels and told us that they treat it just the same as they would treat viewership on 4's own VOD. But in speaking to 4, we heard of the kind of many challenges which need to be negotiated in order to make this strategy work, because they are cooperating and competing with the very platforms that they're trying to distribute on. So 4 told us of difficulties around advertising revenue and funding. They struck a deal to get ad funding beyond what YouTube's normal CPM rate is, so treating them above and beyond just being a kind of another content creator, but there are still problems. It's not as valuable to them as their own viewership and their own services is. There's the potential loss of credit to PSBs in these spaces, so people go and watch a Channel 4 program on YouTube and feel that it's a YouTube program and not a Channel 4 program. There's the question of prominence, which was obviously massively on the table in terms of the recent Media Act, but doesn't extend to YouTube, so 4 have to work within their algorithm. There's control over those algorithms, not just the content that gets serviced, but what gets surfaced after 4's content. So is it going to be some content that risks their reputation? There's the access to user data. These platforms are black boxes. They don't give Channel 4 or ITV direct access to the user data. And then there's just issues of kind of platform governance and infrastructures. What's valuable and monetizable on YouTube today might not be in 2 months from now. They might shift their own strategy, and Channel 4 are kind of in the wake of that. So underpinning these challenges then is the broader issue of sustainability. So PSM's really a sort of caught between a rock and a hard place here. They're competing in a digital media ecology where there is a requirement to be agile in operating and targeted in their delivery, but they're competing with platforms that in their own language can move fast and break things. And with freezes on funding across the board, there's the prevailing sentiment that it is increasingly financially unsustainable to try to chase innovation and maintain obligations to universality at the same time. So the people we spoke to at ITV were particularly forthright on this, of needing to almost work out what PSB obligations mean in this environment. And part of this is the difficulty of maintaining broadcast spectrum, which we've heard a little bit about today, with declining ad revenue, while being forced into a marketplace where they have to expand and innovate in the digital ecology at an increasing cost. And this was often framed, again, as Channel 4, BBC, ITV, all of our broadcasters thought of themselves as being comparatively over-regulated to commercial streamers. And so navigating these potentially contradictory imperatives is often used by PSM to justify their emphasis on, say, big statement programs, doing less with more. And so some of these problems we're seeing around the diversity of content provision is kind of tied to this issue of sustainability. And finally, the last kind of issue that we saw was issues of path dependency. Okay for time? Yeah. I'll be quick. So we heard then about internal barriers to PSM's long-term transition to operating as digital-first organisations. This is in terms of breaking down organisational silos, developing future-orientated skill sets and digital mindsets. It was often kind of this clash of broadcast metrics and digital metrics, and developing and actually actioning digital skills in terms of how to interpret data, how different teams use viewer data in a digital environment. But at the same time, it's still seen as important to PSM that they operate and continue to operate as public service, not being purely commercially incentivized and maintaining an editorial mindset. And that attempt at difference was particularly evident in the personalization study. So we found that in terms of the level of algorithmic personalization, simply how much of what you see when you turn on iPlayer is personalized to you and how much is determined by algorithms, that there was a variance amongst the BVODs. BBC iPlayer, the largest of the organizations we looked at, was quite unsurprisingly the most personalized service, but personalization was much less prominent compared to studies of Netflix, for example. And editorial intelligence still shaped how viewers were exposed to content within these services. So looking beyond the pure level of personalization, we see the principles guiding algorithmic recommendation. And this was a sort of question that we posed to a lot of the organizations themselves, how they tried to balance these logics of retention with values like diversity, pluralism, and universality. And for most organizations on this kind of light end of the scale, the development of recommenders is still so recent that this balance isn't really on the table yet. It's not on the agenda. But for the Flemish broadcaster VRT and BBC, there was discussion about the importance of embedding values into algorithmic curation. So VRT is mandated by its contract to develop what they call a taste-broadening algorithm, introducing and measuring serendipity of recommendation. And for the BBC, they've made a concerted effort to bring together data science and editorial to embed what they call business rules into its algorithm, to effectively limit and buffer the recommenders, so that algorithms adhere to BBC's commitment to issues like impartiality, reputational risk, protecting viewers from harmful content, etc. So that's where we are with the findings. Now to the actual interesting stuff, which is our recommendations. Thanks, Kathy.
So I want to leave a bit of time for questions, so I'm going to do this quite quickly. But we've been taking those findings and thinking about the really important question, which is what does it mean for the values of public service media and how public service media are able to fulfil those values and what needs to change. And these are the 6 core values that came out of the research that we're doing. And we've tried to sort of map how to maintain those values to against some recommendations. So universality, the challenges of audience reach that Dan was talking about make universality really difficult, and we found universality an increasingly contested term in policy debate and within the broadcasters themselves. And so we argue that there needs to be a redefinition of universality in the platform age. So we think there needs to be much clearer guidance about how to balance between broadcast and online provision. We think there needs to be some specific thinking around what the role of public service media on social media and video sharing platforms should be. And most importantly, we think there should be responsibilities for the platforms in providing the infrastructures within which public service media operate. And this leads to our second recommendation here, where we think there needs to be a more integrated approach to platform and public service media policy. So generally, platform policy thinks about online harms, and then public service media policy focuses on getting the public service media organisations to do more or less. We think that the approaches to platform regulation needs to consider the impact of platforms on public service media and how public service media might offer some solutions to the challenges raised by platformisation. Very briefly on some of the others. In terms of quality, this speaks to the BLAST panel, the fact that it's harder and harder to match the quality of content by subscription video on-demand services. And at the same time, we see that there are concerns around diversity. So our research shows that if you're just watching on a VOD, you're probably getting recommended a less diverse range of content. So we think it's really important that public service broadcasters retain a public service identity on their video-on-demand services, and we would like to see a common industry framework for evaluating public service media provision on video-on-demand services. We're concerned that the broadcasters are just going to be marking their own homework. So how do we actually evaluate what they're doing on their VODs? We could talk more about that in the questions. On pluralism, public service broadcasters talk to us about how they have one of their key roles that they can play is in challenging mis and disinformation and supporting pluralism. But we think it's increasingly hard for them to do that if they're not on social media platforms. And so we think there need to be some regulations to protect and encourage public service media distribution on social media platforms and video sharing platforms. I won't go into the details of that, but happy to answer questions on that. Last two, accountability. Trust, again, came up in our interviews. It's become much, much more important to the legitimacy and future of public service media when whole swathes of audiences don't really have any brand attribution or brand value for public service media. And also accountability becomes harder and harder once you're in a sort of video on demand world where it's much harder to hold the public service broadcasters to account. So we think there needs to be greater accountability and engagement with the audience to increase trust. And finally, on innovation, Dan was just talking about how we heard again and again from public service broadcasters that they need to innovate, but there are challenges to doing that, particularly financial ones. And we think there needs to be regulation to enable innovation without diluting the value of public service media to society. So we would like to see some encouragement for innovation in social and cultural interest. And we could talk a little bit more about that. So thank you very much. The whistle-stop tour through 2.5 years' worth of work. But as Torin says, we've got a conference coming up in the 16th, 17th September, open to academics and also people from industry. It's not just an academic conference. We're happy to meet with you and discuss the findings. We've produced a whole load of policy briefs, which are on our website. They're all 4 pages, oriented to non-academic audiences. And you can find us on our socials. And we look forward to comments and questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Well done. Getting all that together, there's a huge amount of work, as you can see, that's gone into that. And I'm going to just start off with a couple of questions just to sort of clarify a few things while you're thinking yours. Have you had a chance to share this with any of the UK broadcasters and public bodies yet? And if so, what sort of response are you getting?
Do you want to say?
Yeah. So we presented basically this exact presentation with a little few slight few changes to BBC about a month ago.
Yeah, a few weeks ago.
And they were particularly responsive to some of the recommendations we made around the need for greater regulation of social media in a space where, I mean, for the BBC, it's too risky for them, they feel, to go into these spaces. But there is an obvious tension that, you know, as your audience is getting younger and that's where they find content, that's their routes to content that they need, that they might eventually need to be there. And so some sense of regulating that from the outset, I think, is important to them, and they were quite responsive to that.
They've had a bit of a problem with social media, as we know, so I can see why they're slightly worried about it.
But across the board, I feel, was there any moments of pushback? I'm trying to remember. I don't think there was major pushback.
No, I think they were fairly at least open to having the conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in terms of government, I mean, some of your recommendations are regulations, some of them are getting together the other platforms and so on. I don't see many forums, though Carol may know better than me, as to where those sorts of conversations are going. We know how hard it is to get anything done in this space. It took so long to get the media bill together. Are there any real priorities here, you think, that are more important than others?
Well, we've been having conversations with Ofcom in terms of their future-looking review around public service media. And one of the tenor of that conversation tends to be a concern about increasing regulation on public service broadcasters when they're facing so many challenges and problems with sustainability. And so the argument that we're putting forward there is that there needs to be really serious consideration of what the policy options are to regulate the wider platform infrastructure. So if there was one thing that I would push, that would be the recommendation that I would push. And I think it needs a level of ambition, but I don't think these are conversations that are happening across Europe. These are conversations that are happening in other places in terms of what can we do to place greater regulations on the platforms in order to enable our public service broadcaster to thrive. And the last panel and the discussion of levies is exactly the kind of thing that should be talked about in that space. So that, for me, is the most important thing. That's where the conversation should be. And I was quite pleased. I was speaking at the Westminster Forum, Media Forum conference, which brings together policymakers and industry. And I have been speaking at those for about 4 years and banging on about platform regulation and social media, and it's never, ever been an issue. Everybody was talking about, do we need greater regulation of social media and platforms to make it a better space for public service broadcasters to be in? So I do feel like the dial has shifted a bit in that, yeah.
That harm and safe space became the big issue, and last week the campaigners for greater regulation were disappointed with what came through from the government and made that very clear. Does that take over the whole debate, and then the rest actually is seen as less important?
This is one of the problems, and one of the things I love about public service media as a system, as a regulatory system, is it's a piece of positive regulation. Instead of saying we're going to try and stop things from happening, which is what all the online harms thing is, how do we stop bad things happening? Public service media regulation is all about how do we make good things happen. And so I really think that there is something about taking that approach to media regulation and saying, how do we make good things happen on YouTube, where that's the majority of why young people are watching television? How do we make good things happen for them? So things like regulation that says social media platforms like YouTube have to upweigh certain kinds of public service remit content in their algorithms, for example. It has to upweigh news from trusted news providers like our public service broadcasters. That kind of regulation is positive regulation rather than thinking about how do we reduce harms. And it's one of the wonderful things that I think that public service media regulation does, is it thinks about positive outcomes.
And can that be done just for YouTube in the UK or Europe, or does that have to be a global thing so it's never ever going to happen?
The good thing about the online harms regulation is that it shows that we can regulate the platforms in the UK. So that online harms already creates a regulatory infrastructure for regulating the platforms in the UK. So we are already regulating them for harm, so we can regulate them positively.
And in the regulation for harm, I will come to the audience, are they responding, or is it one of those things where actually, if they don't respond, nobody's actually going to take, as we've seen with other regulators, people just don't do it?
Ofcom can fine, and they can fine quite high. So we'll have to see.
I mean,
but,
yeah, I don't know how many people heard David Dimbleby's brilliant Radio 4 series today about the water companies, which was the final episode, and the regulators don't do anything. They get huge fines and nothing happens. So
yes, it is a worry.
It's a bit depressing. Graham, did you have a question? If we get you a mic, we'll get you a microphone.
The choice of Belgium is an interesting one, but it's also an awkward one. It's the only country in Europe which has separate public service broadcasting for two really coterminous nations.
Yeah.
The organisations barely speak to each other.
Yeah.
They certainly don't do things
They share the
together.
same building. It's so funny.
And you don't mention this. This is the elephant in the room. I mean, Belgium is like two countries. Is it a problem?
We try to distinguish in the slides when we're talking about Wallonia, which is the francophone part of Belgium, and when we're talking about Flanders, which is the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium. So we work very closely with both of those organisations. Our project partners in Belgium are we talk about 7 markets, 6 countries and 7 markets.
You're presenting in one country this year. You might actually bring the two together to talk to.
Well, we
in the BBC you've dealt with both of them, love them both, get on well with them both, but get the impression the only time they ever meet is when they're talking to us.
Well, one of the things that we've done on the project is we've held 2 knowledge exchange workshops where we've brought public service broadcasters together in rooms with Chatham House rules. So say what you want. And we did get, RTBF did come along when we had one of those in VRT, and they're in the same building. They're just separated by a collar. They did meet each other. Yeah.
They have been getting involved in more co-production, partly as a necessity. Yeah.
I once saw Gone with the Wind in a cinema in Brussels, and you couldn't see the screen because the subtitles filled the whole screen. There were so many different... Anyway, Carol, over to you. Yeah.
Thank you, and thank you for all the work that you do. It's so invaluable. I just wondered whether you were going to be making any recommendations in terms of prominence. I keep coming back to the AVMS directive, Article 13. It's not just about quotas, levies, investment obligations. It's about we are obliged to give due prominence to certain kinds of programming, public service media program. Will you be making kind of recommendations to government so that you just mentioned, upweighing in algorithms? I think government's got to be presented with a toolkit of various possibilities. Like I was talking to MEPs
Speaking
recently.
to the microphone, Carol.
Sorry, talking to a Slovakian MEP, and she said, let's go into Netflix, let's go and see what it... And there was Slovakian programs. There was Europe at the top, in the top band. And I think we've probably got some really good examples of where platforms across the board could be obliged to give more prominence to PSB or PSM programming. Just wondered if that was what...
We have been feeding back into the consultations that are out at the moment on the Media Act in terms of prominence. So Ofcom have been consulting on those, implementation of those. In our policy briefs, we have recommendations, and so we've produced sort of overarching policy briefs, but we've also got country-specific ones, and we have been sending those out to politicians as well as to Ofcom and the broadcasters and other interested parties. So we do hope to continue on this, and we have got Ofcom and a number of other regulators putting a panel together at our conference, and looking partly at prominence. So we think there's more work to be done there, but it's an interesting one, prominence, because there's the regulation as it stands. I think there's a general sense that the Media Act didn't go far enough, but when is there going to be some a political will for another piece of media legislation? I think there might be around digital IPTV, DTT, and then maybe at that point we might be able to get some other stuff in. But I live in hope.
We've got a question over there, just there. If you keep your hand up. Yeah, yes, you. Yeah, thanks. Yeah. And then one in the back.
Thanks. Kenny Barr, University of Glasgow. Just a quick question on the issue of future-proofing. You talk about accountability. So I wonder if you saw any... Because it seems to me future-proofing the funding, but also future-proofing the kind of legitimacy or the value that audiences put in public service media. If you saw any significant discrepancies or divergences across your sample countries, depending on how they are funded, so you might have licence fee or household levy or taxation, if that had a kind of market difference.
Is there a different value placed on it because of where the funding comes from?
I'd like to say yes, and I don't think so. Because I think the most legitimate are in Denmark, and it's cultural. It's a cultural. It's cultural that they are legitimate, and it's also a small language nation, and so the fact that they produce Danish programming is much, much more important. So they don't have the problem of that we have of, like, Netflix producing adolescents, whatever. I don't think it related to funding.
No, it was more in terms of language, their existing kind of credibility and legitimacy prior to this. It's almost like it's exacerbated problems of legitimacy. I mean, you can see that in the UK, obviously, in terms of how the BBC is presented. But in terms of the actual funding, I mean, other than just to sort of boil it down to no, because even in something like the UK, where if you compare, I'm trying to think of like the example of what content appears in the VOD in terms of those values of diversity and pluralism. We didn't see a vast amount of difference between something like BBC iPlayer and ITV, even though ITV is ad-funded. In fact, it was presented to us by someone at the BBC that they think of themselves as a subscription organisation, and what they're offering is a sort of subscription style. So there was already that kind of shift anyway. It just seems like it's kind of exacerbated already problems that were already there.
I think the walls have fallen, Graham, I'm afraid. There's a question in the back in the back row.
Not universal across the BBC,
no, but
it was one particular person.
But they said it multiple times,
yes.
So it wasn't like we caught them in one sentence.
Hello, Andrew Board, VLV. Catherine, you said that PSM, you see PSM regulation is a positive thing to make good things happen. And you're talking about public service content. I just wonder, in your dealings with the various countries that you visited, was there any kind of standard definition of what PS content and PS media is?
In a sentence?
Well, I think they look. Honestly, they look to the BBC. I can't tell you how important the BBC is for the picture across the rest of the world. And so, inform, educate, entertain is still this really important mantra. Definitely. We saw in some of our countries, they were really surprised that when we showed them iPlayer, they were like, "Where's the news?" Right? Because they see this, they have this vision of what the BBC is, and then they're like, "Well, DR has news on a second rail. Where's the news? Where's the news on iPlayer?" Yeah, exactly. So it is interesting. I think that the sort of general kind of that sort of general mantra is shared. It is worth saying, however, and this is why we end on values, is that across the board these values are up for grabs. There is a sense that we might not be able to keep doing this. We might not be able to keep being universal. We might not be able to be as diverse as we are or meet the needs of diverse audiences in the way that we used to. So there is a sense that things might go.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is there a standard definition that you work to for PSM? Have you tried to define
That's a good question, Dan.
Of the values or of content?
Do you mean of what public service media content is, or public service media values?
Public service media values.
Ooh.
Well, we began, I think, just as a sort of helpful scaffold with the EBUs. Is it the 5 or 6?
6 values from 2012.
You can't make me list them off the top of my head right now. But the sort of usual of universality, diversity, pluralism,
accountability,
innovation, maybe, and is there something about like excellence?
Excellence.
But really, the sort of frame of our project was not to necessarily impose those definitions, but use them as frames and to see what. If we look at the practices and look at what the organisations are telling us, to what extent are they being defined in maybe different ways across the different
And
contexts.
were those concepts being embraced by the countries in Europe as well?
I think there's still definitely a sense in which they want to associate themselves with those concepts, but whether to some extent it was a little bit rhetorical at times, and to some extent it was really evident in their practices, but it's not always easy to sort of see how the idea of themselves as being universal links to what they're actually doing, or the idea of what themselves as being plural links to what they're doing. So there are moments of sort of disconnect which we were really interested in finding as we did the project.
We definitely saw a difference between what the public broadcasters say they're doing and what they're actually doing, and it's one of the reasons why I'm concerned about how Ofcom are implementing the Media Act, that they're basically relying on the public service broadcasters to mark their own homework, and that we need to have tools that enable us to hold them accountable.
So my final question is, are Ofcom invited to your conference that you're
Yes,
having?
they're coming and they're giving a panel as well. They're involved, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Yeah, is this a question here? Yep, if you bring the microphone. Can I just talk about iPlayer? It suddenly occurred to me, I mean, the BBC has it in its own hands to actually promote public service content on iPlayer, which I don't think it does.
That's not, our research found it doesn't do that,
No.
or it didn't do that at the time.
Hi, Kathy. Gareth from the International Broadcasting Trust. Do you think are the incentives right for our PSBs to want to designate their players? Their streaming platforms don't have to be designated as public service broadcasting platforms. It's a choice that they have to make, and then Ofcom are currently consulting around what they would have to do to be able to be a designated service. As I understand it, the incentives are that they would be more prominent on streaming televisions, on smart devices and so on. And I'm hearing from one PSB, I won't name them right now, that they're willing to walk away from that. They say, well, it's just not worth it. The obligations on us to make public service content prominent that's too much. So have we got the incentives right? Do we need to go further to actually encourage them to designate?
I mean, it's a really good question. I think that the prominence legislation doesn't go far enough in terms of what it gives the public service broadcasters. And I was a bit disappointed to read today that Ofcom are they're not. I don't know whether they would have I'd have to look again at the legislation, whether there was an opportunity for them to broaden it out. But it's the platforms that are used by the largest number of people. And one of the problems with that is that we know, for example, that young people use gaming consoles far more than any other segment of the population to access video on demand services. But those platforms fall out of are likely to fall out of the connected devices that are within scope for prominence, because if you look at the population overall, not that many people use them. So I think there's a real problem in terms of the designation, and it doesn't look like Ofcom is going to do anything about that. I think there is an issue, and I think we don't have voice prominence related to voice on for audiovisual and TV watching. We don't have things like prominence on social media. So I think that is a really big question. I think if a public service broadcaster chooses not to designate its VOD, I would like to hope that there will be some ripples as a consequence of that, because that tells us that the regulation isn't working, right?
It's why our recommendations are across the board systemic and not just treating as it's been treated for so long, that kind of media regulation regulates the organizations, and that's the kind of levers they pull around what can we do to sort of regulate or to sort of upweight the organizations. But we need to now think wider than that, because rightly so, the incentives are sort of out of line with what the actual reality of a digital media ecology is now.
Thank you very much both to you and to all the audience for really good questions. Thank you very much indeed.